Hey there folks, Cozzy here for Pick 1 Pack 1, and welcome back to our continuation of the Intro to Draft series, specifically Draft 102, Evaluating Non-Creature Cards. Thus far in this series, we've looked at how to evaluate creature cards, we've looked at how to evaluate removal, and we'll now be looking at how to evaluate two subcategories that remain for our non-creature spells. Specifically, the first one is we're going to be looking at how to evaluate pieces of equipment. Now, for the Magic players amongst you, myself included, I initially had a very low estimation of equipment based on a couple of assumptions that I'll go through later in the video, and I was wrong. Equipment plays quite a significant role in Eternal. So let's take a look at what the benefit of equipment is. Basically, it allows you to cast a big creature in installments. In this example, we're going turn 3, playing the Rebel Sharpshooter, a 3-cost 3/3, and then in turn 4, we can choose to put the Morningstar on the creature for a total cost of 7 that's been split up over 2 turns. And so what we've been able to create is a 7-cost 6/6, basically thanks to the fact that the Rebel Sharpshooter not only is rocking a bow, but she also gets her mace as well to help out. And when you think about it, how many 6/6s are there in the game of Eternal? Not a huge number, so this creature's now become a bona fide beefcake and a real problem for our opponent to deal with. Furthermore, rather than casting our 6/6 on turn 6 or 7 like we normally do, because we've been able to pay for it in installments, we now have this on the table nice and early, whilst my opponent is otherwise maybe casting a 2 and a 3 drop, 5 drop, something that is going to struggle to contain the power of this newly equipped creature. Sounds good, doesn't it? You know, sounds like this is an amazing plan. Why don't we all have many more pieces of equipment? Well, the catch is we've got to remember removal in the game. And the specific catch when it comes to equipment of a removal like Annihilate, it doesn't just kill our 7-cost 6/6 creature. It's not a 1-for-1 exchange. Rather, it kills both our creature and our piece of equipment. And if you guys know me at all, or if you've been watching this video series for a while, you'll know that I'll detest this notion because I'm giving away card advantage. For one piece of removal, my opponent has gotten 2 cards of mine, both a creature and an equipment. And so I'm down on the card for card exchange if we're just looking at trying to line out our cards on a table. This is basically the reason why the equivalent card, similar to weapons, auras in Magic, were never super popular. We just don't want to give up card advantage. And so the only way that you'll change your mind is twofold. One, the aura or equipment has to be super pushed. It has to give you a really strong benefit to basically outweigh the risk that you're taking on board of getting 2-for-1s. And fortunately in Eternal, a lot of the equipment is quite pushed, so that works well. And 2, you need to consider how strong the removal is in a format, which is why we're talking about equipment after having learnt how to evaluate removal. The thing about Eternal is there isn't a lot of unconditional removal. Everything has conditions, and you can often tell according to your opponent's colors what conditions their removal will likely have. And what this means is you can mitigate the risk of getting 2-for-1s because you can play around what you see with your opponent. And to be frank, a lot of the removal is scarce in Eternal. There are reasonable chances that when you play your 4-drop equipment, your opponent doesn't have the removal in hand. Historically, I used to get in trouble. I was way too tepid. I was way too cautious about putting on my equipment because being a Magic player, I just assumed that they had removal in their hand because in most Magic formats, removal is relatively plentiful. I realized I was incorrect in this regard. I needed to get more aggressive and more assertive because it is much, much, much scarcer in Eternal. And so that does improve our evaluation of equipment overall. If that's the case, what are the criteria I'm looking for when assessing my equipment and working out if it's something I want to include in my deck? Well, I believe that there are 4 main categories that we want to keep in mind when analyzing these particular cards. First of all, I want to ask myself, how well does equipment facilitate my ability to evade my opponent? How well does it help me get in those last couple of points of damage for the win? And so evasion is a really important criterion to be considering when looking at pieces of equipment. In a similar aggressive vein, I want to be considering how well equipment can assist my clock. Now, what I mean by that when I talk about a clock in a game, the idea is, let's say my opponent is on 10 health and I have a 2-2 down, and if I were to attack every single turn and nothing else was to change on that board state, then my opponent is on a 5-turn clock. 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 10. So a 5-turn clock basically means that they have 5 turns to try and change that status quo, to find a removal, to find a bigger blocker, to get extra life, whatever they can do to try and change that clock. If I play a piece of equipment, I can reduce that clock by increasing my creature's power. And that basically means I can reduce the number of turns that my opponent has a chance to respond before they lose. So the clock is something that's important to keep in mind. We can also consider how equipment helps us break open parity board states, or board stalls. We've all seen the games where we have a bunch of creatures that can't profitably attack into each other, and equipment often allows me to make a creature big enough that we can finally start getting aggressive again and start attacking in and problematizing blocks for my opponent. And then finally, on the opposite end of that coin, equipment can help give us a pause, or a timeout, or a form of respite. One where our opponent is attacking down and we can make our creature big enough that they can't profitably attack into us anymore, and it gives us time to find better responses. Now, as far as the value of these, I generally value being able to break open parity the most, and then giving my creatures evasion for the last point of damage. The other two I'm just bringing up because they are considerations, but I don't think they should be primary considerations. Let's take a look at some examples. Here for evasion, let's imagine that my opponent is on 1. I've done a great job as the red deck, I've been beating down, and then finally they feel as though they can stabilize because their back alley bouncer is way too big for me to ever attack into with my Ronin. Having a piece of equipment can allow me to get in those last few points of damage. All of a sudden my guy becomes a 5 power unit with overwhelm, which means that against the 3 health I'll be getting a last 2 points of damage in. Yeah, currently it's offering up a trade, but what the equipment can allow me to do is to get those final few points in that I might not otherwise be able to do. Even better if their opposing creature isn't quite strong enough to trade off. There are other forms of equipment that give more pure forms of evasion, to be able to just fly over the top and get straight in. I don't know whether I love Elder's Feather, it really depends on the deck that I'm building, but it's important to realize that this is an option that it allows me. It's another strategic element that I'm now afforded to think through. And indeed, even unusual pieces of equipment can help in this regard. By giving my creature quick draw so that it's not going to trade off in a block, I'm putting my opponent in a very messy situation. If they can't afford to take the damage, then they're going to be forced into chump blocking, and I can get some value that way to accommodate for the risk that I've taken with my sidearm. But yeah, these are all about using cards to upgrade a creature so that you can finally get in for those last few points of damage, adding on to the evasion. We talked quickly about the clock, the idea that instead of my opponent who's on 10 being up against a 5-turn clock because I have a 2-1 Ronin, by adding the Blackguard sidearm to him, he now has 4 power, which means that my opponent is on a 3-turn clock. And so I've effectively stolen 2 whole turns from my opponent to find ways of dealing with my creature. Is it a risk to be putting on equipment just for this? If I'm worried about my opponent having a torch, then certainly. And so this is why it isn't just a slam dunk win for me. It is something that I need to take a pretty strong risk analysis for. And indeed, there are cards in the game that are quite resilient against removal that I'd be very happy to be using my equipment on in this scenario. Anything that has Aegis, or anything that I know slides in and around the removal that my opponent is likely to have, could incentivize me to want to both pick and use equipment for these very reasons. Parity is the big one, as I foreshadowed before. This isn't an unusual scenario. On turn 2, my opponent played a Stranger. I played a Xenon Destroyer for my 3rd turn with 3 power, and then they cast another 2-drop. And all of a sudden, I'm in real trouble. Why am I in real trouble? Well, Eternal, it intrinsically favors the blockers because they get to choose how they want to block. I'm forced to attack in with my 3/3, and if they double block, then I'm trading their 2-drop for my 3-drop, and they still have change. That's a horrific position to be in for me. I'm losing value, even though it's a 1 card for 1 card. They only spent 2 for theirs. I spent 3 for mine. They're getting the bargain. But by having equipment, all of a sudden I can have a profitable attack into what is otherwise an unprofitable board state. Now, this is a very simplified example. 2 creatures versus 1. Oftentimes this will get a lot more complex with 5 or 6 on both sides. And that's where working out where your profitable attacks are and anticipating the equipment that you can use becomes a really helpful skill to develop. And even if it's one where you're getting a 2 for 2 exchange, but you're getting their biggest creature plus something else, this is where the equipment really shines, because it allows you to try and get your value in. So that's breaking open parity. And then finally, we have the example here of getting some respite. I've only got my Feln Stranger. I'm getting beaten down by a pair of back alley bouncers. The 2/2 isn't going to stop them from attacking because it's just a chump block. But again, if my Morningstar comes to my rescue by all of a sudden having a 5/5 on the table, they're not really incentivized to chump attack in. Granted, if I'm on 4 or less life, this doesn't help, but it's something. And this is why respite is one of my lower priorities, because even in this scenario, let's say that I got a 4-drop 4/3. I feel as though I'll be in a pretty equitable position. So the weapon is adding extra risk, but not necessarily a lot of extra value. So there you go. There's the 4 examples that I like to think through. I generally think that the equipment is best at breaking open board store positions, and that's the way that I really like to analyze my equipment. And if that's the case, it matters to me how much they increase both my health and my power. So this leads us to one of my very standard questions. Is there a useful vanilla test that I can employ that will help me work out a rule of thumb for my equipment? We know that a vanilla test is relatively easy to do for creatures in Eternal. It's a bit more complex when it comes to our removal, but is there something similar when it comes to equipment? Well, I'd argue there is. It's not quite as simple with creatures, but it's not too bad. And it comes down to a concept that I've learned as the magic number. Now, this is an idea that I learned from Ari Lax. He's a Magic the Gathering pro who writes for Star City Games, which is where I was first introduced to this idea. I'm not sure if this is the genesis of this idea, but with my research, that was the earliest reference that I could find of the magic number. And this is an idea that Ari likes to use when analyzing any new format for Limited. In Magic, we get Limited formats about every quarter, so you need to be employing these skills quite regularly. And I know that in Eternal, we're having a new expansion pack coming out sometime within the next week, or if you're listening to this after today, probably has already come out. And so this is a technique for looking at a new format. What the magic number is, it's a concept where if you're to look at all of the creatures at common and uncommon that you'll regularly see, there's generally a number where their power starts to struggle to attack into. So there's a common power that they cap at, and if you can get your toughness above that number, then you can block for days. And inversely, if you know what that number is and you can attack higher than it, then you know that this is a good attacking unit. So let's actually do this practically. I'm going on to Numot's website where he's got all of the cards listed out. I'm aware that some of these are slightly out of date, but this will work just for demonstrating the principle. So here we can see all of the creatures that cost 5 or less that are uncommon or common, because that's the lion's share of what you'll generally come up against. And what I want to do is take a look as I scroll down and see if I can see any numbers that are particularly rare. So here we'll see there's a lot of 1/1s, there's a lot of 2s. We occasionally see someone with a power or health of 3. Here's an unusual guy. They've got a power of 5 and a power of 4, but that's really not the normal case. Again, we go through. There's a lot of 1/1s, there's a lot of 2/2s. You get the occasional guy with a health of 4, but generally I'm noticing a particular number that these creatures seem to top out at. I'm not sure if you guys have noticed it too. A lot of 2/2s, a lot of 1/1s. Hopefully this will be giving you guys a bit of a hint. I'm not trying to be too subtle. Occasional unusual one here with a health of 4. And as we go through all of the colors just quickly, because there aren't a huge number of common and uncommon creatures, hopefully you'll start to see a trend. What's that trend? Well, I think we see a lot of creatures with 1, 2, and 3 power, but not a lot with 4. 4 seems to be where they taper off and become quite uncommon indeed. And likewise with our health, we see a lot of 1, 2, and 3, but 4 seems to be the number that is rare. And so if everybody in the format has 3 power or less, that probably means that our magic number for this format is 4. And so if I can get any of my creatures' health above 4, then they're likely in a position where they're going to be a very effective blocker. And inversely, if I can increase my creature's power to above 4, then they're likely to be able to break open this board state. So if that's the case for our vanilla test, I'm looking at equipment that can get most of my creatures above 4. And given that the lion's share of my creatures will be 2 drops or 3 drops that are 2/2 or 3/3, it means I'm probably looking for at least +2/+2 or +3/+3. And if I can get it for roughly the same cost as what I get for a creature, then I think that's probably worth the risk of 2-for-1ing myself. Now, of course, there are other pieces of equipment that are still quite good that don't quite fit to this vanilla test, and that's why this is a guideline rather than a rule. But I think this is a good rule of thumb. If you ask yourself, does this piece of equipment get my creature up above a 4/4? And if you can get it to a 5/5 or a 6/6, that's when you know that you're looking at a pretty good piece of equipment indeed, so long as it isn't costing you more than 4 or 5. Indeed, I'd probably put those right at the top end. I'd generally prefer mine to cost 3 or 4. So there's our vanilla test on our pieces of equipment, and we've talked through the scenarios when we want our equipment to be applicable. And I think if you're to apply these two rules in general, you'll be doing pretty well. It's really, how well can I break open that parity state, getting my creature's health and power up above 4 so that I'm most likely to break open these parity board states. What other kind of spells do we have that we need to talk through? Well, there's a couple of subcategories for them, and I'll go through these relatively quickly because I started off the video series with the most important cards, and we're tapering off towards the end here, although there still are some gems that can be found in the bargain basement. So our other spells, we can look at combat tricks. And it's worth noting that with combat tricks like Finest Hour, all of these represent an intrinsic card disadvantage. Jargony sentence there. What do you mean, Cozzy? Well, every single one of these spells only lasts for a moment, and then they disappear. And so unless I can get value in that moment, then I've thrown away a card. And that is a big cost. And so what it means is, going back to another concept that we talked about before, the floor on all of these cards, rather than the magical Christmas land, the floor is very low. I plausibly have cards in my deck that will do nothing. So I really want to be making sure that the ceiling on these cards is exceptionally high to mitigate that risk. Generally, the thing that helps combat tricks out is the element of surprise. Part of that is because I assume that my opponent who I'm up against is a very good player. And if I'm up against a very good player, they're going to be making blocks that are advantageous for them. They're not going to be making silly blocks. And that's unfortunate for me because, as I mentioned before, Eternal is a game that intrinsically favors the defending player. So if we go back to our parity example here, my opponent's always going to be blocking with their pair of 2/2s on my 3/3. It's just a smart block for them, they get value out of it. And the catch with using my Morningstar here is it really telegraphs what I'm trying to do. If, however, I attack him with my 3/3, especially so because he's reckless, so my opponent can't read quite as much into it as they ordinarily do, then a combat trick here can be glorious because it allows me to blow my opponent out and catch them off. And basically, try and be tricky. The hint's in the name with a combat trick. The thing about it is that I am risking card advantage. And so I want to be making sure that I can get whatever value I can out of it. Oftentimes I'm relieved when I can get value out of my combat trick rather than stoked. So some of the things I want to look for in my combat tricks are basically qualities that can guarantee my creature lives. If my combat trick can give quick draw, I'm happy. If my combat trick can increase my creature's health enough so that I'm confident that once the blocks have gone through, my creature will still stay alive, then I'm relatively happy. In general, though, I probably want a combat trick or two because that element of surprise is so important in wrong-footing competent opponents. Let's move on to the next one, card draw. Now, card draw is generally a powerful form of spell because it allows me to get card advantage. It helps with my inevitability. It helps me draw for my most powerful cards. And the other thing it also helps me do that a lot of people forget is that it helps me draw for my power when I'm power screwed. It helps me try to manage one of those quadrants of the games where oftentimes I'll automatically lose. So for that reason, I really like card draw. The thing is though, the card draw has to be cheap for it to work like that. And this is the reason why I generally prefer the card draw that costs 3 or less, because that's the early stage of the game when I'm most likely to get power screwed. Wisdom of the Elders is a fantastic card for this very reason. Cards that cost 8 for card draw, I'm not so hot on because it doesn't help me with that extra option. It's important to note, and a lot of people fall into the trap, that card selection is not the same as card draw. Scheme is a great example of this. Draw one of the top 4 cards of your deck, put the rest on the bottom. I haven't gotten any card advantage out of this card. All I've been able to do is to pay 3 to look at more cards in my library and choose one. So it's card selection. Why is this a problem? Well, I've effectively spent a card to get a card, so I'm still neutral there, but I've spent 3 whole power for the right to do it. 3 power that could have been a creature or a removal spell or something else. And so there's an opportunity cost associated here because it's not really getting me further ahead in the game, and indeed that tempo loss could be pushing me that little bit further behind. There are other cards that look like they're card draw, but you need to look at them carefully. Draw 2 cards and put 1 back on the top of your library isn't card draw, it's card selection. Unless you happen to be in a deck with echo cards and you can be tricky and work around it. But yeah, when it comes to looking at our card draw cards, I generally prefer them to be cheap, so that way they can help me find my power or indeed my color fixing when I need it earlier in the game if I'm real trouble, or I can use it later on to dig deeper into my deck to try and find the cards that are going to win me the game, to try and find my better quality cards. And this is not to say that card selection doesn't have a role. If I have a deck with some really powerful bombs and I know all I need to do is find it, then I'm probably wanting some card selection in my deck. But it's important to be constantly thinking through what both the floor scenario is for our cards, as well as our ceiling. If we continue on, the next category of cards are cantrips. And these are cards that have 3 magic words on them, draw a card. And so unlike a lot of our combat tricks and unlike some of our other categories of spells that we're going to get to in a moment, the advantage of these particular cards is that their floor is higher than normal. There's never going to be a scenario where they cost me card advantage because they automatically replace themselves. And so instead, I just get to look at the effect and work out whether it's strong enough. So let's go back to our idea of a floor ceiling analysis and apply it to Levitate. What's the floor for Levitate? Well, worst case scenario, it costs 1 that I can cast at any time because it's a fast spell and I get to see a new card and miss out on its ability. It's not the end of the world. If I draw this in a top deck war once we've exchanged all our resources, well, worst case scenario, I just look for another one and I get to see the next card down. What's the ceiling then? Well, it gives me the opportunity to give a creature flying. That can allow me to attack in and give it evasion for the last couple of points, or it can also allow me to be tricky when my opponent attacks with a flyer and they think that I can't block because I have no flyers, and I can cast it on one of my creatures to suddenly take to the skies and smash an irritating bird. And so whenever I see cards that say draw a card, I'm generally a lot more interested in them. And I'm a lot more generous when it comes to my floor ceiling analysis. The final category of cards, such a rubbish category that it doesn't even fit my C theme. It's the dross cards, the rubbish cards, the dregs. I could think of a word that started with C, but I'm trying to keep this video applicable to all. These are the cards that generally don't do much at all. They don't fit into our previous categories of combat tricks, card draws, or cantrips. So for example, in Oasis Sanctuary, you gain 5 health. It's a spell, it costs 3. If you were to go back to our quadrant theory and think about which aspects of the game it helps you in, then I think you'll get a pretty quick answer as to how much I like this card. Does it help us in development? No, it doesn't add anything to the board that's going to pressure my opponent. Does this help us in a board stall? No, it doesn't break open the board stall, it just gives me a bit of health. Does this help me when I'm ahead? No, just gives me more life. Doesn't help me increase my clock. It doesn't help me put on more pressure. Does this help me when I'm behind? No, not really. It might buy me an extra turn and increase my clock by one. And so I get to see what the next card of my deck is that I would have been drawing anyway if I didn't put this card in my deck. So yeah, they're a bit of dross. They're the cards that aren't really looked favourably on from our cabs theory because they're not affecting the board. Now, it's worth noting that you do occasionally get a gem in the dross category. There are some cards that have their scenario with our floor ceiling analysis that are good. I can think of things like Paladin's Oath Book. I can think of other cards like that where their floor is very low, but the ceiling is phenomenal, and so that's when you have your opportunity to think through whether you want to put it in your deck or not. Indeed, when it comes to analyzing spells, I think the floor ceiling metric is probably the most useful rule of thumb you can apply. The one thing to keep in mind though is most people have a natural bias to not think about a card's ceiling, but to think about the magical Christmas land, which we talked about in a previous video. And knowing that that's our psychological bias, we need to keep that in mind, especially when it comes to cards like spells that have a strong risk involved in them. So let's practice this a little bit and take a look at a couple of these cards. Let's take a look at, say, Song of War. This is one of those dross categories because it doesn't really fit in any of the other ones. It's a spell that just does stuff. The stuff that it does is it gives all of your units Warcry, which is a fantastic ability. A lot of people will see this and they'll go, geez, this card's amazing. I'm going to have 4 creatures on the table. I can give all of them Warcry. I'll attack in. I'll get +4/+4 on my next thing. And each time they attack, I'm going to keep getting value. And look at how cheap it is. It only costs 2. We need to ask ourselves how realistic that assessment is. What's the actual ceiling for this? Now, the number of times I have 4 creatures that I'm comfortable attacking with all of them for is probably a scenario where I'm attacking for lethal. I'm not going to be attacking with 4 creatures in a board stall because likely we're in the middle of the game, we're both on 10 to 16-ish life, and they'll just attack on the swing back and smash me. So realistically, the ceiling is probably I got 1 or 2 creatures early in the game. They've been able to play 1 creature that might trade off with my 3-drop, and I can give both of my creatures Warcry and get a +2/+2, possibly having to chump in with a creature or just giving my 3-drop the opportunity to attack in. How much is it worth paying 2 to give 1 or 2 creatures Warcry? Well, the fact that Justice has a card that costs less, gives 1 creature effectively Warcry as a one-off, and also allows you to cantrip, probably starts to answer the question about just how high this ceiling really is. We're probably only on the 2nd or the 3rd floor of our building right now. And then, when we start to think through the floor of such a card, I think my true opinions start to show. If I'm ahead and I get Warcry, it's probably what's known as a win more card. And the reality is I don't care if my opponent's on -42 or 0. If they're on 0, that's all that matters. I've chalked up the win. If we're in a stagnated board, the likelihood of me getting Warcry working on some of my creatures, it's relatively low, especially if I've spent a whole card on this rather than having an equipment. If we've traded out resources and we're in top deck, I'm going to be livid if I draw this card. It's absolutely rubbish. I'd much rather have a creature. We can look at a couple of other cards too. Slow. Doubles the cost of a card in the enemy's player's hand. The floor of this is perhaps we're at the spot where we've both traded out and my opponent has so much power available, whatever they happen to draw, they're going to play straight away anyway. And because this isn't a fast spell, I've got a dead card sitting in my hand. The magical Christmas land is that I get to do it early, and I can get rid of a removal or one of their best bombs by making it too expensive for them to ever see. And the ceiling is somewhere in between. But overall, I don't think this card would impact the board remotely enough for me to want it. Reinforce, we've talked a bit about before. The magical Christmas land is that I have a weapon and allows my weapon to keep attacking in. Or I've attacked with a weapon and they've used a combat trick to make their creature powerful, which will destroy my weapon, and I can keep my weapon alive. But the floor is such that I've only gained some life. Counter spells or spells that counter a spell, are one of the more interesting ones and one of the slightly more contentious ones. Players will often go, well look, they'll play some amazing spell, I'll be able to counter their harsh rule and giggle whilst I smash them in the face with my creatures that would have otherwise been dead. And it is true, there are magical Christmas lands where you can counter their most amazing spell and they're going to hate you for it. There are realistic ceilings as well, where you'll be able to just counter something useful and keep going on with your life. But there is a flaw attached with these kind of cards. And it's a flaw that's slightly tricky to analyze and a lot of people miss. And it's actually a tempo flaw. The idea being that if I want to hold up my backlash that I was lucky enough to draw in my opening hand, so I know that I can use it whenever, then I have to keep 2 power open the whole time. I have to wonder whether I want to cast my 2 or my 3 drop. Perhaps once I get to 4 power, I'm casting a 2 drop to hold up the backlash instead of playing a 4 drop. And all of those turns where I've missed out on using all of my power, I'm getting further and further and further behind. And then yes, they finally play a powerful card like a Smuggler's Stash, and I can counter it and giggle to myself. And most people will just remember that Christmas land moment of happiness as they wrap open or pull open the wrapping on the present. But we quickly forget about the fact that the previous 4 turns, I've missed out on so much value that I'd likely be better off for if I was to use. The final one that new players often get themselves into trouble for are cards that interact with the cards that their opponent owns. Steal a card from the top of the enemy deck. I like to assume, arrogant or no, that I am a good deck builder and the overall quality of my cards will be better than my opponent's, at least until it has been proven otherwise. And so as such, by taking one of my opponent's cards or messing around with their hand, I'm probably in for a bad deal. I'm also not affecting the board. All I'm doing is going for a card neutral play and missing out on my opportunity to cast a 4 drop or a 3 drop for it. Please don't consider the stuff that messes around with your opponents as just too much of a flaw. So there's an example from each of our coloured cards, but ultimately the most important principle here is to be thinking through your flaw, your ceiling, and your magical Christmas land. The one other thing I'd like to encourage is to be cynical of these cards. Rather than asking yourself the question, why should I drop them? You want to ask yourself the question of why should I include them? And that is because all of these cards have the lowest of low flaws, where they can just be cards that do absolutely nothing. So they really need to have an impressive upside to be worth including it in your deck. So there you have it. We've looked at our equipment, we've looked at how you can use your quadrant theory as well as your magic number vanilla test, and looking at the scenarios that you want to contemplate the worth of your equipment in. We've looked through our spells, and ultimately it's about remembering your floor ceiling analysis. You'll note that I haven't spent a lot of time telling you which cards I think are great. And that's because I'm only human, I make mistakes, I don't even think I'm one of the better drafters in Eternal, I'm just one who wanted to have a bit of fun making a video series. And I want to tell you my thought process so that through a discussion we can improve together and know what framework we want to analyze through. And I probably get things wrong, I probably overvalue and undervalue cards, respectively. But by showing you the framework rather than just telling you which card gets an A, I think it enables all of us to improve collectively. So that's it. Draft 102, we've evaluated the creatures, we've evaluated removal, we've evaluated the spells as well as the equipment. And so now that you've completed Draft 101 and 102, you should be able to competently and confidently analyze which cards are objectively good and build basically a good stuff deck with all of the decent cards and not have cards that just are so bad that they actually cost you matches. But there is more, and that's what I want to continue in next week. There is the idea of, rather than just including cards that are objectively powerful, we want to include cards that are contextually powerful and that get stronger and stronger and raise the ceiling as a result of having other cards around them that help out. And so that's where we're going to be looking at deck analysis and deck construction, and then finally moving on to archetype analysis. So anyway, folks, I've been Cozzy. I hope this has been helpful for you. If this is something that is useful for you, please feel free to subscribe to my channel so you can get updates whenever more of these videos come out, to share it with your friends, to check out our Facebook, insert all of the other things that are useful and helpful. Until then, I've been Cozzy. I hope you guys have a good one, and I look forward to seeing you on one of my future videos.